Good morning everyone, Jason here, and today we are going to learn about animating a walk cycle in Photoshop. Now the purpose of this video is more about introducing some of the animation features within the software. So I will be going through how to actually animate in Photoshop and how to manage the file, because it can be a little bit overwhelming once you add a few more frames to the animation. The video will also cover some animation principles and the basics about animation, but to a less of a detail. So if you are interested to know about this subject, you should take a look at Richard Williams' Animator's Survival Kit and read up a little bit more about this subject. So for today's video, I'll actually go a little bit slower, and what you see here is actually playing in real time. At the end of the video, I will actually have a time-lapse component where I am cleaning up my lines, but for the initial sketch of all these frames, I'm actually keeping it real time so that hopefully it's easier for you to follow with me, especially if you're doing this for the first time. So there are many programs on the market that allows you to do 2D animation. For 2D game art asset creation specifically, the industry usually use either Photoshop or Adobe Animate. For this tutorial, of course, I'm going through Photoshop, and personally I'm also a little bit more familiar with Photoshop. Animate is great, especially if you want to keep your sprites really clean. To me, I'm just much more comfortable with Photoshop, and I'm able to create more fluid lines with the software, and that's the reason why I'm using it for this animation exercise. For this demo, I will be using Winnie the Pooh's model sheet as the main objective of this exercise is to animate a character and not exactly, coming up with a new design. Just to make life a little bit easier, I'll just use a pre-existing model sheet that's available online, which I will also link in the description box below for you to take a look if you want to use this particular character for this exercise as well. So let me just briefly go through the basics of a walk cycle, and this content is heavily lifted from Richard Williams' Animator's Survival Kit, which again is a book that I highly recommend if you are interested in pursuing animation, be it 2D or 3D in the future. So looking at his example of a walk cycle, we can break down a walk to 4 poses, right? The contact pose, the down pose, the passing pose, and of course the up pose. The contact pose is basically the keyframe of any walk cycle. It's the position where both legs are furthest apart from one another, and it's this typical pose that you will see on your traffic light whenever there's a pedestrian crossing and you see the green man or the white man, depending on where you live. This is the pose that you'll see. It's the most iconic pose of a person walking. And next we have the down pose, where the person is actually at his or her lowest height, because his knees are bent as he is pushing himself up. You go on to the passing position, where his legs are actually forming this inverted figure 4. Next will be the up pose, where the character is actually lifting one of his legs, ready to put it forward. So there you have it, the 4 basic poses to form a walk cycle, and of course after that you will just reverse for the other leg to complete the walk animation. To start off, since we are doing just a flat side view 2D walk cycle, we will just put down a horizontal line to indicate the ground plane. So as I mentioned, it's going to be a 2D side view kind of a walk cycle, so there's no perspective involved. Both of Pooh Bear's legs will be mostly on that horizontal ground plane. And before doing anything, and this applies to all forms of animation, not just a walk cycle, it is a great idea to just stand up from your seat and take a few steps. Take note of how your weight actually shifts from side to side as you place each of your foot forward to take the walk, and kind of understand how the body reacts to it when you're walking. And this is important, as I mentioned, to really act out your movements before attempting to animate them. So it applies to if let's say you are doing an attack animation of a character punching another character, it's always nice to actually act out that punch, but before you try to animate it, so that you understand how the body mechanics work for that simple action. So even though I'm using Richard Williams' walk cycle as a reference, I'm going to make some changes to it. In his example, the down pose is where the hands are actually furthest apart, and of course this is his interpretation of the walk cycle. Personally, I find that I have better results if I just set the hands to be furthest apart during the contact pose as well, and it's just easier for me to understand and to draw it onto the page. So I would advise you, if this is your first time doing it, to just keep it simple. Put the frame where the hands are furthest apart on the contact pose as with the legs, so it's easier for you to keep track. So you can see over here, I am starting with just the body and the legs. It is much easier to just isolate a few parts of the body when you are animating, versus doing the whole thing with the head and the arm swing, because it just overcomplicates this task. So try to compartmentalize this exercise and do it step by step. It's much easier. And as you can see over here, I am keeping things rather rough and loose. I will typically go over the lines afterwards once the animation looks right, to sort of clean it up. You don't want to spend too much time and overstress yourself on ensuring that the lines are super clean, because after all you will make changes, right? Sometimes the drawing will look good, but in animation it actually doesn't. So you would have to test out the animation to know for sure. And if you notice, I've actually placed the different frames of the drawing in different layers. In Photoshop, this is how we usually animate. We will just hide and unhide a layer using a timeline window to create the animation. Now, even though I mentioned that this stage is so-called the rough drawing stage, it is important to still get the overall proportions correct, and this is where the model sheet really comes in handy. Always have the model sheet beside you when you are animating so that you can refer back to it. And of course, we are not drawing in the details right now, but to just reference and make sure that your character is at the correct number of heads, you know, the head to body ratio and proportions, they are all correct. That's the most important at this stage. At this stage, you can also start to add in some elements of squash and stretch. Basically, the squash and stretch principle, animation principle, states that whenever an object is kind of landing on the floor, it will squish itself so that it appears to be smaller or shorter in height, but wider in its width. And then when it's up on the air, it's a little bit more stretched out, a little bit longer in terms of length, and slimmer in terms of its width. And this example, you can kind of see it in a bouncing ball, where this effect is the most obvious. So for a walk cycle in particular, the squash will happen during the down pose, and the stretch will happen during the up pose. So right now I'm actually renaming the layers. It's good to practice proper layer naming conventions for any sort of artwork that you're dealing with in Photoshop. However, it's all the more crucial when doing animation, because you'll be working with a ton of frames, a ton of layers, and you don't want to confuse yourself, right? The usual naming convention I have for my layers when I'm doing animation is that I will name them based on the frame number. As you can see over here, the frame numbers that I have are 01, 03, 05, 07, 09, 11, and this frame that I'm drawing will be 13. And I named this because I animate in twos. Now, I don't want to get too technical over this, but basically each drawing is supposed to be exposed on the screen for 1/12 of a second. This number is kind of something that is being passed down since the early days of animation, where Disney animators kind of found out that, you know, for animation it's much easier if you break it down into 24 frames per second. It's just much easier to time out and space out your drawings based on that calculation. And for now, we are not exactly doing 24 frames per second. We are more trying to expose each drawing for 2 frames, right? So we are in total just going to have 12 drawings per second. And for this particular exercise, you will just need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You just need 8 drawings to complete this walk cycle. So this character will take 2 steps in about 1/3 of, is it 1/3? 2/3 of a second, this Pooh Bear will actually cover 2 steps. And once you draw out one side of the animation, you can actually just show the layer, lower the opacity, and just trace it over and just flip the legs. So it's much easier to just draw on the other side. To preview the animation, just go to Window, Timeline, and remember to click on the frame animation. We are not using the other kind of standard timeline that you see in Premiere or in After Effects. We are using frame animation. It's much easier this way, in my opinion. And be sure to set each layer's timing. Okay, there's this little arrow over there. Just click on it and set the timing to be 0.08 seconds. Again, this just means that each drawing will be shown for the duration of roughly about 1/12 of a second. And to create the animation, I know I kind of blazed through that whole process, but basically you create a new frame by clicking on the new frame button, and then you just hide and unhide the layers accordingly to update the frame, and then you just hit the new frame button again to create a new frame, and then you hide and unhide the appropriate layers. And once you have all 8 frames on the timeline, you can just hit play to sort of preview the animation, and from there you can actually make additional changes if you feel that certain things aren't looking too good. But if everything is looking fine, you can proceed to add in the head and arms, like what I'm doing over here. So for the arms, even though Pooh Bear's arms are rather flabby, we should still try to maintain the 3 joint system of the upper arm, the lower arm, and the wrist, and to animate them so that they kind of have the concept of follow through. Basically, follow through is an animation principle which states that objects don't come to a stop at the same time, right? So when you're moving your arm, the upper arm will move first, followed by the lower arm, and then the wrist. So things kind of follow one another in terms of its movements. So try to add that onto your arm animation, and also the concept of arcs, where the an object like an arm or a pendulum kind of move in a arc-like fashion, where it's swinging from a pivot. When doing the individual drawings for the individual frames, try to avoid tangents, basically lines that meet or collide with one another at places where it will be kind of misleading, as each drawing is only exposed for a limited amount of time, and you want your drawing to be as clear as possible. So one way to make your drawing clear is to make sure that the silhouette is looking correct, and also to avoid any form of tangents. At this stage, I also try to make his head bob a little as he walks. Basically, the head will tend to tilt upwards on the down post and downwards on the up post. Again, upwards on the down post and downwards on the up post. Basically, again, this is based on the follow through principle, where the head is actually following the general movements of the body, and it's trying to keep up with the body as it moves. As mentioned previously, it is crucial to be very comfortable with drawing on a tablet and on the idea of drawing in Photoshop in general, to be able to animate quickly on a digital platform. Back in the day, we used to use an instrument called the light box, where we actually put paper on a table which is somewhat elevated or at an incline, and it has a bulb that is actually shining from its back, so that you can actually see underneath the topmost layer of paper and see through your drawing, so that you can actually preview and see what were the previous frames. That process was pretty fun, but kind of tedious, because you actually had to flick through the animation to kind of preview how the character will be moving. And of course, there's no undo button. Whenever you erase, it's not completely, the pencil markings are not completely erased. So nowadays, I think with Photoshop, it's much more efficient and a cleaner process. So similarly with how we do it back in the day with Lightbox, whenever in doubt, it is always a good idea to show previous and upcoming frames of the animation, which are in the other layers, but to review them at a lower opacity, so that you can kind of monitor the volumes, make sure that each drawing is kind of flowing smoothly onto the next one. Animation can be a rather daunting process, again, because of so many layers and frames involved. You have to keep track of so many things, especially for a walk animation. There's the head to keep track of, the arms, both arms, both legs, both feet, make sure that the everything is flowing smoothly. And in my opinion, it is very crucial to remain level-headed and just turn off all forms of distractions when attempting animation. That's my number one advice for people who are trying this for the first time. So of course, right now I'm keeping each frame to be just one layer. However, for more complicated animation tasks, where you have more parts to animate, or if you want to actually color your animation, it's actually a good idea to break up each frame into its own layer group, so that you can just expose that particular group, and it will show all the layers that are within it, which is something that I will actually do later on in this demo, when I'm going into the cleanup stage. So whatever drawings that you see right now are still just rough drawings. I will actually do in the past where I will clean up the drawing, add in the facial details and the shirt that Pooh Bear is wearing. So for this particular exercise, the objective is to create a generic walk cycle animation. So I'm omitting any form of personality for this exercise. Now, usually, if you go and watch Winnie the Pooh, the actual Disney animation, his walk would tend to be a little bit slower, and there will be some form of follow through on his belly and his ears, which to keep things simple for this demo, I'm actually not going to add that in, that feature in. It's good to use some landmarks on his body as a sort of a gauge. For example, his snout is a great way to just make sure that the proportions of the character is correct. I believe the nose is somewhere along the halfway point of his face. So over here, as you can see, the head is a little bit small, but I think it's okay for now, because later on, as I mentioned, I will do another pass to clean up the volumes. When I mean when I talk about volume, I mean the area and the shape of a particular part of the body. For example, the head, the arm, you know, it needs to retain that specific size, so that it doesn't look like, you know, in one frame his head is super massive, and then the other frame his head kind of shrinks for no apparent reason. So when I'm sketching, I don't really pay too much attention to the line quality. If you look closely, a lot of my lines are rather sketchy and hairy. The purpose is to quickly, get that animation, the rough animation out, and make sure that everything flows smoothly and correctly before I actually go back in to clean up on the lines. So just 2 more frames to add the arm and the leg. The whole process of animating this simple walk cycle took me about I think about 1.5 hours to 2 hours, I believe. But the most of the hard work I would say is during this rough drawing process. It is crucial to get this part correct. Once this is correct, more or less it's just autopilot mode, cleaning up. So just scrubbing through the layers to check on the volumes, check on the overall movement, just to make sure that's moving to what I intend it to be. I think I'm getting a little bit lazy here. I'll just move on to the next drawing. Okay, with that more or less done, I'll just preview the animation, and generally it looks fine. But I noticed some weirdness with the right foot in general. So as I mentioned previously, I'm just reorganizing everything into layer groups. It will help me with my cleanup process later on. I will be creating a new layer above this rough sketch to just clean up on the animation. Whenever you create layer groups like this, it is important to just go back and make sure that each frame on the timeline is properly configured to this new layout of the file, I guess. So I just go back into each single frame to hide and unhide the appropriate file group, or the layer group, I mean. So rest assured, unless you are planning to add a few more frames, this is the only kind of tweak that you need to do for the timeline. And once everything looks fine, you can proceed on. But as I mentioned previously, I noticed some weirdness with regards to the right foot. So in this one frame, I believe that was the passing, or was it the... I apologize, it's for the left foot, not the right foot. I noticed in this up frame the left foot isn't moving as much. So technically speaking, each foot should be moving at a uniform speed when it's sliding across the floor like this. When it's, to give the illusion that the character is actually moving forward. It's kind of doing this pseudo moonwalk. So you have to ensure that the foot is actually traveling across this horizontal ground plane. So if it's not moving, it doesn't give off that illusion that, you know, the character is actually walking on the ground. It's actually traveling forward. So I'm just going in to fix some of these issues. And once that is done, it looks a little bit better. Let's see if I made any more changes. Yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with this. Right now, I'll just switch over to the time-lapse version, where I actually start to clean up the character, add in his upper shirt, or yeah, his shirt, not upper shirt, his shirt, and his facial expression, giving him his eyes and his lips and his nose. Just making sure that the drawing is a little bit cleaner. So yeah, I hope that you guys learn a thing or two from this video, and I will see you next time. Happy animating.